Hello and welcome back to a new episode. This is going to be part 2 of the Beach Boys series, and I'm going to be doing Holland, which is an interesting album. Now, there are 5 years and 5 albums between Wild Honey and Holland, and as you can imagine, a lot of evolution takes place between the two, and I get that it's kind of an arbitrary choice to jump between Wild Honey and Holland. But the reason I'm doing this is that while Wild Honey is the beginning of an evolution, Holland is the end of an evolution. And I think that that's pretty clear when you listen to the album itself. However, something I will expand upon a little more in the outro is that it didn't necessarily have to be the end of that evolution. And in many ways it could be argued that it shouldn't have been the end of that evolution, although it was. So anyway, over the course of the 5 albums between Wild Honey and Holland, the band had become increasingly skilled songwriters on their own right. Dennis Wilson and Carl Wilson, Brian's brothers, had really come into their own as songwriters. And honestly, as much as people like to bash them, Mike and Al had some great stuff during the period as well. Or at least as much as people like, including myself, like to bash Mike sometimes. You know, he has some cool stuff, and especially on this album, which we'll talk about. After Sunflower, which I reviewed before on this channel, but I've decided to I'm probably taking that review down because it's not a good review. After Sunflower bombed, they got themselves some new management, these really weird management who basically set his sights on making them really successful again, and sort of succeeded. When I mentioned in the last video that there was a brief moment in the early 70s when the Beach Boys got a little bit of their cred back, I was talking about Surf's Up in Holland. You know, they were never exactly like the darlings of the hippie movement, or like a classic pot-smoking band that you and your hippie buddies could sit and unwind to. But they had a little bit of credibility again around this time that, like I said, went away pretty quick after this period ended, but they had a little bit. Anyway, as part of the very strange decisions that Jack Riley, who was their manager, made around this time, including making Carl the band leader, which actually I think was probably not a bad idea at all. I mean, it sounds like a weird idea on paper, but when you actually look at it, I think it actually worked out really well. But one of the ideas he had that was very strange was take the entire band to Holland. Supposedly the theory was that it would help Brian with his depression, but it doesn't really seem to have actually had that effect. And Brian contributed very little. In fact, if Warner Brothers hadn't originally rejected this album for not having a lead single, Brian would have only had 1 song on it. And as is, the big single from this album has always been sort of rumored to be a Van Dyke Parks song that just has a Brian Wilson credit slapped onto it, although supposedly a recording of them working on the song together exists, so maybe that's not true. The album got into the top 50, it did relatively well, spawned a minor hit in Sail on Sailor, and yet they didn't really follow up the album in any meaningful way with anything that was even remotely like it, which I'll come back to throughout this video because it's really fascinating to me, genuinely. One of the things about this album is that it is very 70s in a way that none of the other post-Smile Beach Boys albums really are. A part of that, I think, is the drive to be successful again, the drive to be contemporary, and that, I think, possibly affects the album's reputation. Like, I'd heard stuff from some of their other early 70s stuff, and I'd been recommended it because it was influential to later material. And that's something. You know, I think Sunflower and Surf's Up and some of those albums, Wild Honey and some of those albums, are influential on later music in a way that this isn't, because this sounds like its time. And part of the reason I think people in the 90s and the 2000s were so easily able to take something like Wild Honey or Sunflower and sort of drag it into the present and be inspired by it is that it sounds very disconnected from its time, whereas this doesn't. And that's interesting to me. But once again, I've rambled a lot in this intro, so I think it's time to actually get to the tracks. So right off the bat, we have Sail On Sailor, the track that the record label forced to be on the album so that it could be a single. And I'm usually totally against record label intervention, but in this case, I think it was actually a good move. I've heard the song that this replaced, and I like it, but it's not as good as this. And also, along those same lines, I think it's very telling that almost everything from the post-Smile era was retired either after Endless Summer came out or in the 10 years following its release. But this track has more or less endured. I don't know if Mike still plays it, but I do know that when I went and saw Brian in 2017, he played it, and honestly that was one of the high points of the night, along with them playing Let 'Em Run Wild, which is one of my favorite songs by the band and nothing I ever thought they were going to play live, but I'm rambling here. And so with Steamboat, we have a fantastic song from Dennis that at points almost kind of sounds like a Pink Floyd song, which is really interesting because Pink Floyd didn't even sound like this in 1972, or at least not that much like this. And now that I'm thinking about it, I hate that during this series I don't really get to talk about Dennis as an artist, but I'll review Pacific Ocean Blue at some point. Because Dennis really came into his own during the 5-year period that I skipped over. Like, he became not just talented, he became arguably the second most talented member of the band ever. This is wonderfully slow and plodding and dreamlike, and it really makes you think of like a paddle wheel steamer slowly making its way up a river or something like that. It's just a fantastic song. So now we get to the California Saga. I believe it's like a 9 or so minute song split up into 3 parts, in which the 2 most musically conservative members of the band up to this point, Mike Love and Al Jardine, craft this epic song, which is just absolutely bizarre to me. But the first part of it is absolutely fantastic, and it's weird because I thought for years, until I did my research for this album as part of this video, I thought this was an Al song. But no, it's Mike, which is fascinating because I generally don't like Mike's songs all that much. You know, he gets a lot of hate within the fandom, which I do and I don't subscribe to. He's a consummate businessman, he's a consummate showman, you know, he knows his audience, and I respect him for that. As an artist, his judgment usually isn't so great, and the Beach Boys' post-70s career is largely a testament to that. But this is absolutely fantastic, this really cool country pop number that just makes me want to visit the places he's talking about, because, you know, I've never been to the West Coast, and one of my bucket list things is actually to see the West Coast, because I want to see what people are talking about. But yeah, as far as a beginning to the saga goes, A+ for me. The splinters of the thunderbolt. Now they're gonna go all pretentious on us. This is a weird poem about an eagle and humanity, and this stops feeling like the Beach Boys, and it feels like something that should be on a Yes album or something like that. It's some weird stuff, and I would be fascinated to know more about the sessions for this album than I do, and, you know, like, what prompted this, because it is just, I don't know what to make of it. It's out there, but I like it, you know? And the saga concludes with a shameless rip-off of California Girls. But you know what? I'll accept it. You know, it's been 7-8 years since that song came out, you know. I'll accept it. It's good, it's great, you know. What you think of this will probably depend on what you think of California Girls as a song. I've never met anybody who disliked California Girls, so I think most people will probably like this. So we follow up one great song with another, because The Traitor is probably Carl Wilson's best song. You know, and the lyrical subject matter makes me chuckle every time I listen to it, because it's a Beach Boys song about colonialism. There are two parts to the song. There's the opening bit about the traitor and all the things he does and the sort of invasion and takeover that he prompts. But then the song shifts to the perspective of a native person or the native people trying to survive. And that's where I think the song really shines, and it goes from being a good Beach Boys song to being a transcendental Beach Boys song. And it's one of the best things to come out of the post-Smile years. You know, Carl has always kind of been an enigma to me, because, you know, he had a wonderful voice, and his voice is all over their classic stuff. But as a songwriter, it always seemed like he kind of came out of nowhere in the early 70s, wrote 3 of their greatest songs, and then kind of faded back into obscurity. You know, nothing he wrote for the later albums really sounds all that good to me, and it seems like he ended his career with the band, and unfortunately his life really, as more or less the legitimizing force for the Mike Love version of the Beach Boys. You know, the way for them to say, look, we got a Wilson, we're still the Beach Boys. And so we have another fantastic track with Leaving This Town, which was co-written by Carl and the 2 new members who were joined after Bruce Johnston was fired, although I, for the life of me, cannot remember what exactly he was fired over. But anyway, they added 2 new South African guys, Blondie Chaplin and Ricky Fattar, Ricky Fattar would go on to be part of the Ruddles later on. And the song is absolutely fantastic. I've heard this compared to 70s Stevie Wonder, and I kind of hear that. Really nice, and it's got a killer Moog solo in the middle of it. Look, I said this a long time ago about a different solo, but like, look, when it comes to solos in Beach Boys music, you take what you can get. It's not Rick Wakeman, but it's good. And so we get another, I believe this is a Dennis track. I think maybe there's a Mike Love writing credit. I'm not looking at the credits right now, but that's what I remember. And honestly, I know a lot of people really like this, and it's not bad. But it's the one track on the album I don't really get into, and that I never find myself listening to. And so we have the final track of the album, I believe the one Brian piece, Funky Pretty, and this track is a classic. You know, weird melodies, weird lyrics, you know, classic Brian. The synths are a really nice touch, and they really harken forward to an album that would come around in about 4 years' time. All in all, an awesome finale to a classic album. Holland is absolutely fantastic. In a lot of ways, probably the best of the post-Smile Beach Boys albums. Although for me, it's always going to be kind of a toss-up between this one and Sunflower, because Sunflower personally has a few more highlights, but this one has a consistency, both in tone and in songwriting, that Sunflower doesn't have. And this really shows to me that things didn't have to be the way they ultimately were, where the Beach Boys, with a few exceptions, largely stopped being good after about 1975. This album shows that things could have been very different. And as I said in the intro, the fascinating thing about Holland to me is that it provides a formula for the band that they could very well have followed throughout the late 70s. You know, there's a universe out there somewhere where the Beach Boys became like a pretty serviceable, you know, art pop band along the lines of something like the Moody Blues, and made albums that were basically clones of Holland for the rest of their career. Because this was the first time in like 7 or 8 years by this time that they really had a formula that they could have followed. And they didn't follow it, which I think is fascinating. I would be very interested to see what a world where Endless Summer was never released would look like. And I was talking with a friend about this the other day. You know, Endless Summer is a fantastic compilation. You know, it's one of the greatest hits albums of all time. But in a lot of ways, it kind of ruined the Beach Boys as a band, because they became obsessed with recapturing the olden days of the 60s, despite the fact that all of them were way too old and had lived way too hard, you know, Brian and Dennis in particular, to do that kind of music in a way that wouldn't come across as awful and cringy and just kind of really disturbing. And there's a couple of songs on the next album I'm going to be looking at on this series that really ram home that, you know, lyrics that sounded great when they were coming from fresh-faced 20-somethings have kind of a disturbing edge when they're coming from drug-addled fat men in their mid-30s. But don't let anything I'm saying distract you from the fact that Holland is a phenomenal album. You know, if I were to rank these guys' albums, this would probably be number 3 after Pet Sounds and Sunflower. It is just that good. And it's an album that you really need to listen to, and you really shouldn't avoid listening to, because I didn't listen to this album for like 2 years after I first got into the band, and I don't really understand why now, but I suspect I probably thought it wasn't good. I mean, like, to be perfectly honest with you, for years I was a purist. I'm like, I'm not going to listen to anything after Pet Sounds, because, you know, I want the sanctity of the Brian material to remain secure, something incredibly stupid like that. But don't do what I did. Check this album out today. Once again, as with Wild Honey, although to a much lesser degree than Wild Honey, at least listen to Pet Sounds first, and probably listen to Sunflower as well. But once you've listened to those, listen to this one immediately.